Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Academy webinar. For those joining us for the very first time, which I actually don't believe, my name is Alina Panadonna, and I'm super delighted to be your moderator today. And as always, we have another brilliant speaker, and I have a distinct pleasure to host Bill Marler, the nation's leading foodborne illness attorney. Hi, Bill, how are you?
Hello, good afternoon for you guys. Good morning for me.
Nice to see you again.
Thank you.
And where are you based now?
Well, right now I happen to be in Michigan. I'm going to be co-teaching a class with Frank Yanis, who you know and others might know.
Yes.
Um, he's teaching a course, a 3-day course on food safety culture, and so he's asked me to come in to speak on a couple of topics, and so looking forward to doing that later today.
That's incredible. I wish I could be there as well with you guys. However, we have a distinct pleasure to host you here at our academy, and we kind of took your 1 hour for us.
So that's okay.
Yeah, so guys, just briefly let me know that you see as well, here as well, so we can give stage to Bill. Just drop a reaction on the bottom. Yeah, I see already first reactions are coming hearts. Bill, you will see it at the end after you stop sharing the screen. But for now, I can't wait longer. So this stage is yours.
Thank you very much, and good to be with you. And I look forward to trying to impart a little bit about, um, sort of the history, a bit of, what I've been doing for the last, hard to believe, 32 years. But I think many of the things that I've learned in litigating cases and obviously meeting with clients and dealing with companies over the last 32 years, I think have some resonance in, going forward and trying to prevent outbreaks from happening. I think one of the things that many people, mostly the public or reporters, don't really quite understand is just how difficult it is to figure out how a foodborne illness investigation outbreak occurs. We all know the statistics that the CDC and then WHO set out on a yearly basis, the number of foodborne illnesses and the number of hospitalizations and deaths. It's a exponential number of people. 48 million Americans get sick every year, 125,000 hospitalized, and about 3,000 deaths. But that those are estimated numbers, and maybe I'll help explain why those numbers are estimated, and frankly, why figuring out outbreaks really becomes very important to really have a better sense of the numbers of people that get sick. But essentially, you have to have an ill person. That person's ill with, one of the pathogens that we are more familiar with, either norovirus, listeria, E. coli, salmonella. In the U.S. right now, there's two salmonella outbreaks ongoing, one linked to cucumbers, one linked to eggs that were just recently announced. The outbreaks, arguably are relatively small, but that person was ill enough to seek medical attention. And then with that doctor's visit, hospital visit, emergency room visit, the doctor chooses to take a culture, either blood or stool, more likely stool, to determine whether or not that person has a foodborne pathogen. If that organism is identified, they are under, by law, in the United States, obligated to contact public health officials. That culture goes to a public health laboratory, which now, in the old days, would be PFG'd. Now it's WGS, which we can talk a little bit more about, just how much, in my view, that's a game changer to really know that you are seeing an outbreak. And just to sort of stop for a second on whole genome sequencing, yeah, with whole genome sequencing, and that's really been growing. The use of it has grown substantially over the last decade. When state health departments, county health departments, even the federal partners are seeing whole genome sequence matched across multiple states, multiple areas, they know fairly certainly that those cases are somehow linked to each other. That technology is that good. So it really does help really sort of start to focus on those people, what their common denominator is. And that's the epidemiological investigation. Where were they, what they do, what they consume in the period of time that makes up the incubation period for that given pathogen. If they are seeing multiple people, and now, with whole genome sequence, multiple people doesn't mean dozens or hundreds. It could be one person in New York and one person in Texas, one person in Washington, but they all have the same whole genome sequence. You definitely understand that there's likely an outbreak going on. So, what is litigation as an incentive? These are stories I've told many times before, but I think in many respects they're 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 good to tell these stories again, because I think many of the same mistakes that were made in Jack in the Box and made in Unwalla are the same ones that I see happening in outbreaks that happen now. Really what I have learned in 32 years is that these outbreaks that you hear about, Jack in the Box, Odwalla, Boar's Head, and others, all of those outbreaks, in my view, are preventable, and they're preventable by people in those organizations paying attention to the kinds of details that prevent these outbreaks. And I always say that now, granted, I always get the ability to look back after an outbreak happens and then see what the cause was. But in all these outbreaks that I've been involved in, there always is an opportunity to fix the problem before it blew up. Going back to 1992, there are a couple of things that are really, I think, kind of important. One is the Jack in the Box outbreak really began in November, December of 1992, prior to sort of it become publicly known in mid-January of 1993. But E. coli 0157H7 was not a reportable disease in California in 1992. Um, the uh, state territorial epidemiologists had not fully recommended that E. coli 0157 be a reportable disease across the United States. And so California wasn't reporting it. And so there was a cluster of cases, primarily in the San Diego area, where there was a child that died and several had kidney failure. But because it wasn't reportable, public health wasn't notified, public health didn't get involved. And so that meat that eventually got shipped across western United States that contaminated with E. coli got shipped to other states. And that's how that outbreak blew up from a handful to hundreds. And eventually, 4 kids died. Nearly 100 suffered acute kidney failure. It was really quite the disaster. The other thing that was important in 1992 was that the state of Washington had increased the cook temperatures for the internal temperature of hamburger to 155 degrees Fahrenheit. That was a change from the US food code of 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The US food code is set as a minimum, and states can change those. They can increase them but not decrease them. And so the state of Washington had increased it because public health in the state of Washington had become more and more concerned that there had been an uptick of E. coli 0157 cases linked to ground beef, and they were trying to deal with that problem. So they instituted that change, and they sent that material out to all the restaurants in the state of Washington and to corporate headquarters of restaurants that had restaurant corporations that had restaurants in the state of Washington. That included Jack in the Box. Then they spent time going to restaurants throughout the state of Washington, educating them on the new cook times, both for hamburger and for chicken. In June of 1992, their Jack in the Boxes had a ability to send to corporate headquarters information from restaurants in the state of Washington. It was a document called In the Suggestion Box, and they would be able to fax it to corporate headquarters. And they faxed this document in June of 1992, so well before the outbreak. And it said, I think regular patties should cook longer. They don't get done, and we have customer complaints. Describe the benefit. If we change this, we will be making our burgers done and edible. You can imagine during the litigation, during the lawsuit against Jack in the Box, getting a document like this was interesting. But it was more interesting to find out what Jack in the Box did following this June 1992 suggestion. They wrote the employee of Jack in the Box back. Her name was Wendy. Says, Wendy, we'd like to acknowledge the time and effort you've taken to contribute to the success of Jack in the Box by enclosing this pen highlighter. Each person submitting a suggestion is eligible to receive one gift per quarter with their first suggestion. And they CC'd a number of people in food safety. July of 1992, still months before the outbreak. Then what did Jack in the Box did? They actually tried to see if they could make their burgers done and edible by increasing the cook times that were been suggested by the state of Washington. And they did. We learned that because we had documents from their corporate kitchen where they repeatedly did test results and found, that the increasing cook temperatures of the hamburger also needed an increase in cook time for the burgers. And we'll see that they chose to not do that. So in August of 1992, they wrote Wendy and CC'd all restaurants throughout the chain. They said, we've researched your suggestion and determined with the variability of our grill temp, 350 to 400 Fahrenheit, the 2-minute cook time is appropriate. What was really important here was is that 350 at 2 minutes just never got hamburgers to 155 internal temperature. At 400, it mostly did. But they were so focused on the fast food aspect of it, they didn't want to increase the cook time because, as you know, internal temperature is a combination of not only the grill temperature, but also the amount of time that it cooked. Had they cooked this for 2 minutes and 15 seconds, this outbreak never would have happened. Yes, it's true that E. coli 0157H7 contaminated meat that was highly contaminated. There probably would have been some outbreaks, some illnesses, but it certainly wouldn't have been several hundred people. So when the Jack in the Box case ended, I wasn't sure that I would continue being a food lawyer. Thought I'd go back to doing other things. And then the Odwalla case happened. Odwalla was a juice company based in California that had decided to sort of make its mark as an unpasteurized juice and sold in commercial settings. They also tried to sell it to the U.S. Army in August of 1996, about 3 months before an E. coli outbreak that sickened over 100 and killed a child in Colorado, and about a dozen children suffered acute kidney failure. So they had contacted the U.S. Army to try to sell the juice on Army bases to healthy Army folks, and the Army came out and did a inspection of the plant in August, in the spring summer of 1996. And to Odwalla, it says, we've reviewed the deficiencies noted in the report, which our inspector discussed with you at the time of the inspection. As a result, we determined that your plant sanitation program does not adequately assure product wholesomeness for military consumers. This lack of assurance prevents approval of your establishment as a source of supply for the armed forces at this time. You would think if a company was being told that the Army wouldn't buy your juice, that you might really sort of reconsider both pasteurizing your product, but more importantly, selling it to pregnant women and little kids. During the course of the lawsuit and litigation, we were able to uncover a number of emails, and one of them that we got, I kept, and I think it's sort of chilling to sort of see the thought process in a company in the months leading up to an outbreak. This was an email in September, so 2 months, 3 months before the outbreak. It's not the vendor's criteria I'm concerned about. It's Odwalla's. Why are we doing it? Why now? What do we want to prove if the data is bad? What do we do about it? Once you create a body of data, it's subpoenable. You should look at this as though the Fresno Bee, which is the local newspaper, has looked into the results and asked a lot of questions. What they were talking about was whether they should be doing whole end product testing, so testing for pathogens. And they decided, corporate headquarters decided they didn't want to know the information, and so they didn't want to create a body of data. They didn't want to check to see if it had pathogens in it, and they sold it anyway. And the result was, as I said, over 100 people sick, one child dead, and eventually, we'll talk a little bit more about this, they were criminally indicted. These folks, some of you may know of them. The president of Peanut Corporation of America, the fellow in the red tie, and his plant manager with the lack of hair. Both of those gentlemen were charged with felonies and spent time in jail. It started with a bit of salmonella. There were 714 culture positive salmonella typhimurium cases in 46 states and in Canada. Ages ranged from babies to people 98 years old. 24% were hospitalized, and there were tragically 9 deaths. The CDC estimates that for every one person counted in a salmonella outbreak, there's about 40 others, actually 38.5. I'm not quite sure who's the zero point 0.5, but that about 40 times that number of people actually were likely ill from the salmonella outbreak. But there are people who either did not test positive, were not hospitalized, were never tested, or frankly, were just not sick enough to seek medical attention. There were congressional hearings. Emails were found. Parnell, the president, emailed to employees, turn them loose. He's talking about product that they knew was testing positive for salmonella. The testing and the destruction of products was costing them huge amounts of money. And one of the chilling things, I go through this about once a week. He wrote in a June email, "I'll hold my breath again." For those of you who don't know the story, what happened was uh, Parnell and Peanut Corporation of America had contracts with big companies like Kellogg's, and Kellogg's required end product testing. So they would choose a lot to test, and then they would send out the lot for that test result would come back positive, and they'd have to destroy the lot. Parnell then came up with the idea of taking multiple tests from a lot, sending it to different labs, hoping to get a negative result. And so they would get 4 or 5 tests out. 2 or 3 of them would be positive, one would be negative, and they would ship it using the negative certificate of analysis. Eventually, they would just get all positives, and they just started using whiteout and putting in the negative tests when they knew they were positive, and the outbreak happened. They were charged criminally with 76 counts in a federal indictment. What's interesting is under U.S. law, at least before the recent administration, under U.S. law, if you intentionally put contaminated product on the marketplace, you could be charged with an intent crime under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and each count would be punishable by up to 10 years in prison and a $1 million fine. So these folks were experiencing potentially many, many years in jail and a significant fine. Stuart Parnell and Michael Parnell went to trial claiming they were not guilty. They both were sentenced, Stewart to 28 years in prison, Michael to 20. Sam Lightsey and Dan Kilgore, the plant managers, they pled guilty, never spent any time in jail, and testified against Stewart, Michael, and Mary Wilkerson, a former quality assurance manager, who was part of the scheme to white out and falsify certificates of analysis. The charges were mail fraud, wire fraud, and here's the felony part: it's introduction of adulterated and misbranded food into interstate commerce with intent to defraud and mislead. Here's an interesting part of the U.S. Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that's a little interesting and has now dramatically changed with the new administration, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But you can be charged under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act with a misdemeanor. And unlike a felony, a misdemeanor does not require intent or even knowing or willful conduct. Um, Essentially, if a company is producing food in insanitary conditions, if they ship that product across state lines, they can be charged with a misdemeanor, which can be up to a year in jail and a $250,000 fine. I think people can have a discussion about, whether or not, you can be potentially put in jail or fined significantly by without sort of knowing that you're doing it or intentionally doing it. But again, the the handful of times when companies, and I'll talk about those specific companies, when companies have been charged with a non-intent misdemeanor crime and fined or potentially jailed, has been exceedingly low in the last 30 years. The criminal sanctions are rare, but they're large, and some of these you might know of. Bluebell ice cream. The president went on trial. Actually, it's been a bit ago on a felony charges for potentially under not reporting the listeria outbreak. He was actually found innocent and said that he wasn't knowing, but the company was charged $19.5 million, and that was essentially because their plant was producing food that made people sick, and when the FDA inspectors went in, they determined that the plant sanitation program was, very lax. ConAgra, it's a company that sells lots of different branded products. They essentially had several, E. coli, salmonella outbreaks over a relatively short period of time in the early 2000s. And I think, frankly, the FDA and the federal government just got a little tired of, cleaning that up, and they got an $11.2 million fine. Chipotle, a little bit more recently, it's almost been a decade ago, they were linked to multiple outbreaks in 2015, E. coli, salmonella, and norovirus outbreaks in multiple states. They were charged $25 million. Wright County Ag, this was the only case that I know of in the last 30 years where a person was charged not only with a misdemeanor and fined, but also spent 3 months in jail. Mr. DeCoster, who was the president of Wright County Ag, Jack DeCoster, I think, probably he single-handedly with his egg producing companies over the course of decades was probably the reason why Salmonella enteritidis in chickens is become so endemic in the U.S. He had a series of chicken farms in Maine and throughout the eastern United States, and then on to Illinois, that had repeated problems with hundreds of people getting sick and deaths. Odwalla, we talked a little bit about that earlier. They were charged with a $1.5 million fine, relatively low given the egregious nature of, I think, of what they did. Jensen Farms was an outbreak of listeria in cantaloupe. They pled guilty to 5 counts. They were not fined, and they spent no time in jail. but that listeria outbreak sickened 148 people, 33 deaths, primarily in the Colorado, Nebraska area. It was listeria tainted cantaloupe in 2011. So the criminal sanctions are rare, but they've been large, like I said. And just recently, uh, President Trump has sent out one of his presidential announcements and said that no longer would the Department of Justice prosecute these kinds of crimes. So uh, perhaps there might be a situation where the Department of Justice might, uh, go after a company like the Peanut Corporation of America that knowingly shipped contaminated product. But these other sorts of crimes that I've just talked about that are misdemeanors, at least under the President Trump administration, it's unlikely that there'll be any prosecutions. And in fact, many of the people, in fact, all of the people at Department of Justice who would prosecute these crimes have been reassigned. We still obviously have problems in the U.S. In 2018, there was an outbreak of E. coli 0157 in romaine lettuce that sickened over 240 people. There were 5 deaths. Um, in 2006, there was a relatively similar sized outbreak. About 220 people sick from Salinas grown baby spinach. That in 2005, the leafy green industry, essentially called that their 9/11. Not to take anything obviously away from 9/11, but they went and did all these changes or all the things that they wanted to do to make sure that the government didn't regulate them too much. But clearly by 2018, they had 13 years to clean it up, and they never did. And when where this lettuce was grown, it doesn't take, in my view, it doesn't take much of a rocket scientist to realize that there's a reason why these outbreaks keep happening. When you're growing product in close proximity to cattle feedlots, and in the U.S., investigators are not allowed to enter these feedlots for testing confirmation, but it's pretty clear how this outbreak happened. And unfortunately, this is a problem that's continuing to occur despite some movements in the Food Safety Modernization Act. We still have not really come to grips with environmental contamination by cattle in areas that also have grow leafy greens and other ready to eat food. Can't forget boar's head. It's from last year, and there's been plenty of outbreaks. I'm representing several of the individuals who got sick and the families of those that died. I think anybody who takes the time to read the publicly available inspection reports of the factory realizes that this was a company that had lost its way, a very very famous brand that I think were probably more concerned about their brand, or had they been more concerned about their brand, they would have paid more attention to the ongoing inspection problems. Interestingly, my friend Frank Yanas has been retained by Boar's Head to try to help clean that up, and I wish him the very best. And this was the my and apologize if I'm offending anyone with my politics, but I think that unfortunately we're seeing a lack of enforcement of laws in the state of Washington and other places in the U.S. Simply because with a felon in office, why not? So with that, I'll stop sharing. I'd love to answer. I hope I've left a lot of time for questions. I'd love to answer any questions that you guys have.
Thank you so much, Bill. And you guys give as much appreciation as you can with more heart claps. And yeah, now, Bill, you finally can see it. Yeah. Right. Perfect. And yeah, there is a question answer time. And I will take my turn first if you don't mind.
Sure.
So, the first thing, of course, as we are talking about the cost of outbreak, and you mentioned a couple of times that it's really important to identify the outbreak source quickly. How would you assess the effectiveness of current traceability technologies in speeding up outbreak response and litigation? Or what still need to be improved?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly have the technology available. I think with especially with whole genome sequencing, that's been a big game changer to really know that that you really have an outbreak going on, and you can really sort of identify for sure that you've got the right culprit, so to speak. I just did a I had a, E. coli 0157, an HUS case in Utah that was an isolated, quite sick little boy, and the health department found it that he was an isolated case, and but we wound up testing sort of everything we could ever think of that was in the child's home, and we found that the dog food that they purchased tested positive for E. coli and is a genetic match to the little boy. So we do know what the cause of the outbreak was. It wasn't really an outbreak; it was a single person. So we've gotten way better at that. The traceability rule that's part of the Food Safety Modernization Act has been, kicked down the road one too many times, in my view. We do have the ability to, trace things back to the source, and I think a lot of people think that I'm in favor of that because, I'm a lawyer and that tracing it back I'm allowed to sue people. But, I can do that myself. I don't need the FDA. I can do it through the courts. I can do it through subpoenas. I can get there. It doesn't change that. But I think the important part is for the public to feel comfortable and confident that its public health officials are doing that work and it's public, and because the most important thing, I think, is when you trace back the product and you can figure out what the likely cause of the outbreak is, because that's how we learn.
Yeah.
Humans are, invariably, we have to learn by touching the hot stove. That's how we learn. And I think so, to the extent that we can give people better understandings of why these outbreaks happen and what can be done to prevent the next one is a really good thing. And so, that's why I'm a fan of traceability. I can do my trace back myself, from a legal point of view. I don't really need the FDA and the CDC to do that for me.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And if we are talking about international supply chains and
Hmm.
imported foods, how do you see the cross-border accountability involving? And could, for example, international legal cooperation prevent future outbreaks?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, um, having the ability for, an importing company, because in the US, it's the importing company that's ultimately going to be responsible if something bad happens in the U.S. and vice versa. You know, uh, you know, I think a lot of times people forget that U.S. has imported or exported a lot of products that have made people sick, and and our friends in Canada have actually even at times banned some of our products. Mexico has banned some of our products simply because we are poisoning their citizens. So, it's a cross-border situation, and but those importing companies are the ones that bear the legal responsibility. So, I can go through the chain, but the importer is going to bear the responsibility. So that's really why importers, really do have to pay attention to the food safety culture, the food safety processes of food products they're importing. And, you know, uh, the I think there's a lot of times that people in the US assume that imported products are not as safe as products grown in the US. I can tell you that still the vast majority of the products that cause outbreaks are homegrown products in the United States. They're not necessarily imported products.
Yeah, and it was so funny that in your presentation was mentioned the phrase "remain calm," and it brings to mind how humor and headlines shape the public discourse. And what about like in general how media's framing the outbreaks,
Yeah,
helping or hurting?
yeah. I mean, that's a really good question. There was article, I think it was a week or two ago, on the front page of the Washington Post about an outbreak that I essentially uncovered. 89 people sick, E. coli linked to romaine lettuce, a death, 7 children with acute kidney failure, and half the people were hospitalized. And the FDA and CDC chose not to fully report that, even though they know who the processor and grower of the product is. But they said because the outbreak was over, there was no need to tell the public. Obviously, I think that's not the correct way to do things. I think the public has a right to know that. Um, and because, I have subpoena power and I can do that, I'll get to the bottom of this. I actually know who the processor and the grower is. So the FDA is not, you know, hiding things anymore. But I think that's a story that was on the front page of the Washington Post because the public is concerned that, and the press is concerned that the FDA and CDC are not being allowed to do their jobs. Certainly media gets more wrapped up in some outbreaks than others, depending upon the product. If it's a product that impacts children, or if there's specifically a very compelling story about a victim. If the brand like Boar's Head is incredibly popular, and they have a lot of ongoing problems. I mean, that's just going to vary from outbreak to outbreak. But I think anybody who pays attention to the media in outbreak scenarios realizes that it tends to get highly publicized, both in the U.S. and around the world.
Yeah. And if we are talking about like the core of our topic, true cost of outbreaks,
Hmm.
could you elaborate on what aspects are more overlooked, especially by policymakers when
Yeah,
calculating the economic impact? Yeah,
yeah. I mean, um, if you just think about the the cost, the medical costs that some of these families face. I was talking to a family last night whose child developed severe hemolytic uremic syndrome, and he's 3 years old and stage three kidney failure. So he's likely to lose his kidneys probably in the next few years. The change in that child's life, and who's going to pay for the medical bills. It's going to be insurance, that people have premiums, that people don't have insurance. Is the public going to pick that up? I mean, it is not. And if I can't figure out who the source of the E. coli is, but if I can, the company will have to pick that up. But it can be millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars for the change in that child's life. Might need multiple transplants over the course of their life, and I think of cases that I've had in the past. A little Canadian boy who ate a little bit of romaine lettuce, suffered HUS, it suffered a stroke, and he's now 8, 9 years old, and he cannot walk, can't talk, can't feed himself. I mean, that's a lifetime of complications. And fortunately, I was able to get that family a significant amount of money to put into trust to take care of him. But I guarantee you, they wish they would have their boy back and not the money. So, um, that there's those costs, and then frankly, it's the costs to the companies. Recall costs can be devastating to companies who have to recall products, and then the cost of foodborne illness outbreaks, may well be covered by insurance. Many companies don't have recall insurance, and then it's just the loss to the brand. Will Boar's Head ever completely rebound? Hard to know. But there are lots and lots of companies that have, gone out of business and may never come back because of that. So um, I always tell people, and I don't mean to be flip, but why it's a bad idea to poison your customer. There's the moral reason is, you don't want to have to be known as the source of a 8-year-old boy who can't walk, can't talk, can't feed himself. But you also, from a business point of view, you don't want your company to suffer tens of millions of dollars in losses. So there's really an incentive to try to figure out how to prevent these outbreaks at the very beginning.
Yeah, but considering these healthcare costs, do you see currently that insurers or investors take more active role in demanding food safety compliance?
That's a really another good question. Um, the answer, I think, is probably complex and depends on the insurance company. Some companies, in my experience, liability companies that pay claims, they tend to divorce themselves from the claims paying and then the premiums that are paid, and whether or not, I mean, logically, you'd think that a company that had a great food safety program might get a break on their insurance, and some companies do that. But for the most part, it's all about how much product you sell, how many employees you have, excuse me, those sorts of things that drive the cost of insurance. So, um, yeah, insurance law as it relates to outbreaks, recalls, and stuff don't make a lot of sense to me. So,
Yeah, and if we go back to these criminal charges brought in cases like Peanut Corporation and some other cases, like would you consider this as a more like exception rather than rule to punish publicly like this? Like we try not to touch the current political topic, right? It's more
no,
about
I get it. Yeah, I put it this way. You saw that list I had. That's the list. That's the list that I'm experienced with over the last 30 years. So it's a pretty rare list. Um, but my experience in speaking to CEOs, my experience in speaking at company conferences around the world is that people have been acutely aware of those cases and realize that that's probably not a place they want to be. And so, I don't know with the current situation. My hope is that companies will still do the right thing because it's the right thing. And if the criminalization is not here for a while, um, but I think it has a place. These criminal prosecutions do have a place for these sort of egregious situations, and they have been very rarely enforced. And I think that's probably an appropriate way to do things.
yeah, and you also mentioned using the whole genome sequencing and other
Yep.
genetic testing tools in legal defense and prevention. And would you consider this like the companies are making better of using this tool, or do you find any other still lagging behind regulatory expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of companies that I never hear about, and they're clearly the ones that are doing things the right way. But they definitely, you know, they have the tools. They have the tools. It's really just trying to convince them that it's, the amount of the investment is worth it in the long run. And that's kind of a hard thing. I mean, I certainly um, certainly understand that food production is not necessarily it's not a high margin operation. And so trying to figure out a cost effective way of doing food safety is, certainly it's a challenge. And, um, because um, if somebody invests, millions of dollars into a food safety process, can they guarantee that they're never going to have an outbreak? You know, Probably not. Is and so that then, the CEO is going to go, well, should we make that investment? And I think, that's why having a food safety culture, and it's what we're talking about here in Michigan with Frank Yanis, is, trying to find that balance between, doing the right thing, doing the cost effective thing, making food safety a part of everything you do, and but doing it in a way that makes economic sense because obviously you have to make money in order to remain in business, just like any business.
Yeah, and let's maybe mark social networks as another also trendy tool, because like the explosion of social media basically changed the nature of foodborne illness litigation. And would you consider it also like the bring a change in terms of evidence gathering, brand damage, or jury
Yeah, I mean,
bias?
a good example of that would be the Daily Harvest home delivery food case I've been involved in for the last 3 years. That all of a sudden, I mean, that would have been an outbreak that public health would not have picked up because all of a sudden you had, hundreds and hundreds of people across the country going into ERs, random ERs all over the country, essentially an acute liver failure. And they all consumed the same thing, but it was through social media that they connected themselves. It was sort of uh, mass epidemiology in action, and frankly, figuring out what the common ingredient was frankly quite fortuitous. I had been getting this was in late June of 2022. I had been taking hundreds of calls from people who had eaten Daily Harvest product and were in the hospital. And then over the 4th of July weekend, I got a call from a woman in New York who had read about some woman in Dubai who also was sick, and but they had eaten a completely different manufactured product, these smoothies from Canada. And and when I started digging into what the ingredient was, there was a common ingredient in both the products. And they ultimately we found that ingredient was an unregulated protein that had been imported from Peru. So, but for the social media aspect of it, I don't think that outbreak ever would have been figured out, simply because it was not acute liver failure is not reportable in the U.S. It's the bacterias are, viruses are, but the actual. So it's really interesting, and I think that's probably going to get larger as AI does more and more things, and but obviously too, trying to make sure it's accurate is always going to be a challenge.
Yeah, but still, it's also kind of impact as well.
Mhm.
So you
Sure.
cannot deny it. So we have still more questions.
Sure.
Do you consider that the government has a role in facilitating for the companies to do the right thing in terms of making the legal requirements easy to follow?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there are times where some of the regulatory verbiage from the FDA or USDA can be a little bit difficult to follow. And I've been doing this for 32 years. And sometimes, even as a lawyer, I look at this and I'm like, I have no idea what they're asking people to do. So, yeah, no, I think that, um, that just requires, I think, companies through either themselves or through their associate trade associations to engage in the government, so I really believe that I do firmly believe that the requirements of the companies are super important, and it sets a playing field for people. But I think it needs to be clear, obviously.
Yeah. And I don't see any more question, but what I would ask you, Will, maybe to give a nice, inspiring and motivating summary.
Well, I don't know if I can do that, and I know you guys are closer to cocktail hour than I am. But I think the people who have attended, I think good for you. I think that I may bring a different perspective, but I can tell you that although sort of lawyers, uh, especially in the U.S., lawyers who represent victims sometimes get a little bit of a bad rap, sometimes deservedly so. But I can tell you that for me, seeing people suffer the way I have over the last 32 years needlessly through the consumption of food, uh, you know, changes changes you, and it's why I'll get up early in the morning to do something like this, or I'll fly from Seattle to Michigan to give a talk, or to the halls of Congress to testify, because I think we all have to do what we can do with to prevent these kinds of tragedies. And so I wish you guys all the very best. I'll leave you with one thing. It's not all doom and gloom. um, when I first started practicing law, 90% plus of my work was E. coli cases linked to hamburger, ground beef. That's pretty much zero now. And that's really because government stepped in, said E. coli 0157 is an adulterant, can't be sold in hamburger. Increased cook times, more training happened, more testing and holding, whole genome sequencing happened. All of that happened. And the reality is, it went from 99% of my law firm revenue to zero. And maybe my accountant's mad about that, but it's the right thing to do. And that's a success story.
Yeah.
And it's not translated to all other companies and all other situations, but I think you can think about that as, we can work together to create a positive outcome. And taking money away from me is a positive outcome.
Thank you so much, Bill. And
Okay,
thank you so much, everyone who joined us today. I see a lot of hearts, claps coming, and that's 100% appreciation of our talk today.
great.
Uh, and me, guys, I'm looking forward for our next webinar already next Wednesday with Chris Elliott, where we will also talk about foodborne outbreaks, food safety risks, etc. As basically we always talk about this. And yeah, just wishing amazing day to those who are just at the beginning of working hours, and those who are like me at the end, wishing you exciting evening, and see you at the end at our next academy. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thanks.